Good afternoon. This is Nathalie Tocci, Director of the Rome-based Institute for International Affairs. Thinking about the impact of COVID-19 on global trends, I think we're basically facing a situation in which things could go in very different directions. Now, what is often said is that this pandemic is significant precisely because it acts as an accelerator of existing trends. And it is precisely this accelerating or accentuating effect that it has that suggests that the impact it will have will be profound and structural rather than conjunctural and ephemeral. Now, in a sense, if this is more or less clear, or I think if this is a sort of fair enough hypothesis to make, what is far less clear is the way in which this pandemic will have a structural and profound effect. And essentially, we could see this pandemic working out in two completely different directions. On the one hand, so in one direction, one could alas see the fact that COVID-19 acts as an accelerator of nationalism, of authoritarianism, and of retrenchment and deglobalization. None of these trends, of course, are new, and it is very clear the way in which this pandemic risks exacerbating them. Nationalism had been up and rising already for some time, and it is clear that this is a pandemic in which, particularly in the first phase, there was a predominance of a national instinct that prevailed in the erection of borders, in the restriction of medical supplies, in a general sense of sort of thinking about one's own. Now, at the same time, we can also see the way in which this is a pandemic that could end up reinforcing authoritarianism, which is, of course, not quite the same as nationalism, but very much pushes in the same direction. And in particular, the way in which authoritarian states like China have effectively tried to push the narrative of basically saying that their system of government, their way of, for instance, conducting surveillance is a more effective way than the way of liberal democracies in handling a crisis such as COVID-19. There are also reasons that suggest that COVID-19 could exacerbate trends towards deglobalization, reshoring, and in general retrenchment. Again, this is not something which is created by COVID-19, but which very much had been in the air from the whole debate on the losers of globalization to the very different debate over a decoupling of the US and Chinese economies. And again, COVID-19 and the impact that it will have on the nature of globalization could end up reinforcing these trends. Now, this is, in a sense, in one possible direction of travel. Now, fortunately, it's not the only direction of travel. And I think what is interesting and important and certainly far more optimistic is that there is a very different future which is potentially out there as well, because it is very clear, and it is increasingly clear to all countries, that this is not a health, social and economic crisis from which any of our countries can exit alone. Precisely because the impact of this crisis is so deep, it's so profound, it is so existential, it is clear that we can only exit this crisis together. Now, I think internally within the European Union, we're beginning to get it. The fact that the European Commission has put out a proposal for an extremely ambitious recovery and resilience plan, the so-called Next Generation EU proposal, very much speaks to a leadership which understands that not only we're talking about a profoundly deep and existential crisis, but one through which we can only exit by making a significant step forward in the integration process. Likewise, at the global level, we can see the beginning of some important steps, for instance, being taken in the context of the G20. Personally, I believe that a very important step that was taken, which is indeed only a first step, but nonetheless very significant, is the decision by G20 countries to agree on a moratorium on debt repayment by vis-à-vis developing countries. It is only a first step because what would be ultimately extremely significant would be a complete cancellation of the debt, which is ultimately what is necessary in order for these countries to address the health, the social, and the economic devastating impact of COVID-19. But it is indeed a first step in this process, and I think it's significant that it has taken place within a multilateral G20 context. Likewise, I think what's interesting is the way in which sort of more flexible, less structured, if you like, uninstitutionalized multilateral initiatives are beginning to emerge. I think particularly significant in this respect is the EU-led pledge over diagnostics, treatment and vaccines that rather interestingly managed to mobilize well over 7 billion in a global pledge. Now, of course, the big question, the million-dollar question is in which direction are we actually going to go? There are these two possible futures, and what suggests whether we're going to move in one direction or the other. Now, I think that a big part of this answer will depend on what happens on the 3rd of November on the other side of the Atlantic, meaning the US presidential election. But as Europeans, I think we also have a special responsibility in this respect. Why? Because in order to take one particular future, a future which is more cooperative and multilateral and rules-based, it is us as Europeans that really do have to play a leadership role. We have to play a leadership role because multilateralism is part and parcel of our DNA. We have to take a leadership role because the challenges that we face, particularly in our neighboring regions, from the Balkans to the Middle East and North Africa, in fact, particularly to what happens in the African continent, are so huge that we simply cannot do this alone, and we have to mobilize a multilateral effort. And it's our responsibility to do it because at the end of the day, we're actually quite good at it. As Europeans, we actually are quite good at playing the multilateral game, and we have to use, if you like, the capability and the instinct that we have in this sense, indeed, to move us into one future towards cooperation and multilateralism and a rules-based order, rather than a possible alternative future, which is, alas, equally likely of retrenchment, nationalism and deglobalization. Thank you.